Darkness descended on the streets like a heavy blanket, hiding everything that was not to be seen. The stars disappeared behind the clouds and the moon was nowhere to be seen, the silence of the night broken only by the sound of footsteps echoing off the ruined walls and empty houses. No one expected anything good in this neighborhood, but it was home to those used to pain and fear. Here, amidst the maze of dark alleys and dirty streets, everyone survived as best they could. The woman struggled to move her feet along the ruined road, treading carefully, leaning on her crutches as the last of her strength. The air was heavy with the odors of decay and cinders, and her every step echoed, but she walked despite it. She couldn't afford to stop, she had to keep moving. There was determination in her eyes, but also a shadow she couldn't chase away. Her limp wasn't just a physical weakness, it was a reminder that she hadn't always been this way, and that this city was taking more from her day by day. She walked past the old buildings where the store had once been, now turned into a homeless shelter. The walls stank of damp and the windows were broken. People on the streets looked at her, but didn't meet her gaze. Their faces were withdrawn and alienated, like those who had long ago realized there was no hope anymore. Everyone had their own struggles in this place. But she knew her struggle was more important. She had to get home, or else, she couldn't think of anything else. The shadows thickened, and each step she took became heavier and heavier, and the streets seemed more and more ominous. Suddenly she felt someone following her. Not immediately, but louder and louder, footsteps just like her own following her. She doesn't turn her head, but her heart begins to beat frantically. She feels her skin begin to break out in a cold sweat. Is she really being stalked? Or is it just her imagination? But she already knows the answer. In this neighborhood, no one can be sure of their safety. And so, as she turns the corner, she is met by a figure standing in the semi-darkness. It's not someone from the neighborhood. His uniform, his movement, his stern gaze say it's a policeman. But why is he here, in this forgotten place, on this moldy street? There is no pity in his eyes, no humanity. He looks at her as if she were not a person but an object to be studied. Where are you going? His voice is cold as steel, and his footsteps grow more and more confident. She slows her step, but doesn't stop. Reply. Protest. She knows it would be dangerous to engage in conversation with this man. But he's already taking the first step, and his shadow covers her like she's his prey. Her heart clenches, but she doesn't let her weakness show. She clutches the crutches in her hands, ready to fend off any move, but her thoughts slip away from her, leaving only emptiness. This moment, it's all too familiar. She's experienced it before. And every time she confronts a police officer, she feels the world around her shrinking, her life becoming increasingly tenuous threads. But no matter what happens, she's not going to give up. Are you hiding something? His question sounds like a sentence. She looks up, meeting his gaze with defiance, but something inside her trembles. Because she knows this moment could be the end of her. Her steps became slower and slower, and each one echoed in her chest like the pounding of a hammer. The woman knew it could be over for her right now. But she couldn't give up. She couldn't. The pain in her legs was familiar, but here, amidst the darkness, it became more fierce with each step. She felt the air around her grow denser. Its presence was almost physical. The policeman standing in her way didn't take his eyes off her. At first she thought it was just an accident, maybe he just wanted to ask for directions or something. But no, his gaze was too cold, too focused. He was watching her every move, like a predator waiting for the moment to attack. She could feel his eyes literally burning into her back, making her clutch the crutches in her hands tense. As if those stumps of wood were meant to protect her from something far more dangerous than physical pain. Passers-by on both sides of the street cast quick glances, but none of them dared to intervene. This neighborhood was full of shadows and fear. People had learned to look the other way, ignoring anything that wasn't their personal business. But for the policeman, it was more than business. He clearly knew what he was doing. How long are you going to play these games? His voice cut through the silence, hard and cold. She stopped, but only for a moment. He came a little closer, his steps becoming more and more confident. The woman felt her inner tension rising. He wasn't just stopping her, he was watching her, calculating what would happen next. Do you want something from me? Her voice was quiet, but tense. The words seemed to hang in the air, but she already knew there would be no answer. He would just watch her make excuses. The woman tried to hold herself up, not showing weakness, but every word he said fell on her shoulders like a heavy weight. Suddenly, as if confirming her worst fears, he stepped forward, just as she had predicted. He looked at her crutches, at her limp. It wasn't a casual remark. He knew how to put her in a corner, how to make her feel vulnerable. He used her pain against her like a weapon. She knew that police officers often chose their victims based on some hidden attribute. She was exactly the kind of person they could easily suppress. You shouldn't be here, his words slid over her like a knife across her skin. She felt her chest tighten. This wasn't just a conversion. It was a foreshadowing of something much worse. Fear slowly crept into her body, from the very tips of her fingers to her heart. But she held her gaze, not taking it away from this policeman. She knew that if she showed weakness, he would take her with ease. He stepped even closer, and now his breath was audible. The policeman's face contorted with contempt. He had clearly found his target, and she could go nowhere. His figure obscured all light, and all that remained for her was the wall of fear that grew closer with every step he took. You think I don't know who you are? His words were dark and threatening. He didn't try to hide his intent. His purpose was clear, he wanted to break her. This probably wasn't the first woman on crutches he'd made feel guilty. But she wasn't ready for this. And she couldn't let him win. She gritted her teeth, feeling her legs begin to treacherously shake. She tried to hold her face, but this cop wasn't going to stop. He was getting closer, and she didn't know how long she could hold him off. What, you think this is going to end any other way? His last words sounded like a sentence. The woman knew she wouldn't get out of this with him without consequences. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from, whether you had something similar in your life. We want to know your opinion, and if you like it, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new exciting moments. And now we continue. The woman took a step back, her breath hitching, but she couldn't let herself stop. Her eyes reflected determination beyond fear. He stood there, almost lapping, his eyes drilling her as if testing her for strength, and she needed to move past him, holding back the surge of panic inside. But she knew, this street, this neighborhood, this moment, they were no accident. She'd faced it more than once, and this time would be different. Fury boiled in her soul, she wasn't going to give up. Every look he gave her was an accusation. Not just an inquiry, not just a threat. He saw her not as a person, but as a symbol of all those this city had tried to humiliate. He saw her as everything that was undesirable, a woman, black, with a limp, weak at first glance. But her resilience was her weapon. All she wanted to do was just walk down the street. Just walk like any other woman, but this policeman, this symbol of the system, wouldn't let her. His power was clear and palpable, and every step he took in her direction felt like an extra burden on her. She turned, clenching her crutches. He stood too close, his strength was something she could do nothing about. But she wasn't afraid. She knew that every step she took, every word she spoke, was a protest. A protest not only against him, but against a system that already left her no room to live. What do you want? She tried to say the words calmly, but there was pain in her voice. Pain from years of humiliation, from not being given the right to just be. He looked at her, and something threatening glinted in his eyes. You know you don't belong here, his words fell like heavy stones. You don't belong here. You realize that, don't you? She felt the man's words penetrate her soul. But she wasn't ready to break. This wasn't just a conversation. This was a test. And she wasn't going to give up. She couldn't let this cop, this representative of the system, prove his power. She couldn't let him erase her dignity like he had erased the dignity of millions like her. Her shoulders shook slightly from the increasing tension, but she stood. This moment was too important to just give in. Her steps down the street now sounded like a challenge to everything that held her in this darkness. Not just in her own city, but in her country. "You have no right to judge me," she said, clutching her crutches. Her voice grew firmer. "Didn't have the right and won't have the right." She looked at his face, a face that did not hide contempt. She felt everything she'd experienced over the years gather in her body, and with every word, the power grew. And so, no matter how much he tried to suppress her, she suddenly realized that the only way to survive was not just to be silent, but to declare loudly that her life mattered. That her life was just as valuable as his. And despite his apparent superiority, her right to exist here was no less. Before he could answer, a spark of rage flashed in her eyes. It was the moment she realized she wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting for everything she held dear. Her honor. For the right to be human in a world where her race had always been considered a minority. Only this wasn't some abstract protest. This was a real clash, where her decision to resist was the only way to survive. And she already knew that she would not submit to a system that had long ago decided that she belonged on the margins of life. Every step she took echoed through the empty street like a harbinger of an impending storm. The woman felt her body begin to tremble with tension and fear. She could hear the policeman's footsteps growing behind her, and though she tried not to look back, his presence was more and more palpable. This moment, when she felt the situation was spinning out of control, had come. Her breathing became heavy and ragged, and she tried to quicken her steps, but she couldn't. Her legs shook with pain, and her body resisted. Fear clutched her chest, but she couldn't let herself give up. She tried not to look in his direction, but his shadow was already hovering over her, and this anxious moment was turning into a trap. She turned her gaze back to him only when she felt his hand on her shoulder. It was so sharp that her body, instinctively trying to pull away, shuddered. The woman froze. She tried to catch her breath, but the policeman was faster. "Where are you going?" His voice was hoarse with menace. It wasn't just a question. It was a sentence preceded by violence. The woman felt everything inside her clench, as if she were trapped. She was silent, not knowing what to say. All she wanted to do was pass, just pass by and forget. But he wouldn't let her. "You know there's no place for your kind here, don't you?" His voice became even harsher. He spoke as if her life was worthless. He spoke to her like an object, not a person. The woman felt the words like sharp knives cutting her from the inside out. This policeman wasn't just a representative of authority, he was the personification of everything that kept her from being on equal footing with other people. Her heart was beating with frantic force, as if it were about to burst out. She felt her body react to the growing tension, her fingers tightened around the crutches. This was the moment when her life depended on whether or not she could stay calm. But how can you stay calm when you're being spoken to like you're a worthless creature? The policeman was advancing, his face increasingly contorted with rage. His eyes threw sparks. She couldn't help but notice that every glance he gave her was full of contempt, as if he had already decided her fate. "You realize what I can do to you, don't you?" The policeman raised his hand, and the gesture was so threatening it made her blood run cold. "You're nothing. Just one of the people who shouldn't be here. I'm not going to waste time with your excuses, understand?" She tried to take a step back, but he had already pinned her against the wall, and now there was no turning back. He was hovering over her, his hands hard and fast, and her attempts to escape his grip were futile. "What, you think I'm going to let you go?" His voice became threatening and harsh. He was confident in his power, as if all her fears were just another little thing that could be easily crushed. She knew the cop was the one who made the rules in this neighborhood. And her life meant nothing to him. Her consciousness was starting to slow down, but she couldn't give herself a chance to give up. This wasn't just a case. This was a fight where everything was at stake. And now, finally, she had made up her mind, she would not be silent. She wouldn't watch herself be humiliated, cornered. "I'm not afraid of you." Her voice, though trembling, rang out with determination. She raised her eyes to meet his gaze. It was her weapon. Not silence anymore. Not cowardice. The policeman froze for a moment, his eyes throwing lightning bolts. He had not expected such an answer. But there was still not the slightest sign of doubt on his face. This wasn't mere violence, it was an assertion of power, and every moment of humiliation mattered to him. He was willing to do anything to prove that she had no right to resist. And it was at that moment that her heart beat faster. She wasn't ready to give up, but she didn't yet know what would happen next. Every word spoken by the policeman was like a hammer blow to her body and spirit. The woman felt her strength draining away like sand through her fingers. He was standing right in front of her, his gaze pierced with contempt, and his words continued to pour out like loose poison, poisoning everything around him. This was no longer just a detention. This was an attack on her dignity, on her existence. "Look, what, you think anyone's going to help you?" His voice was as cold and hard as stone, and he built up the tension more and more, giving her no chance to justify herself. He spoke as if every move she made was a mistake, every word a lie. The woman tried to say something in response, her lips trembling, but her words were lost in his harsh remarks. She wanted to explain that she wasn't a criminal, that she didn't deserve to be treated like one. But with every word he said, she felt her own confidence dissolve. This moment was not just a clash with authority, it was a clash with those who didn't see her as a human being, but only an object to be humiliated. She couldn't take back her words, couldn't make them meaningful to him. He didn't want to hear her. He didn't want to see her as a person. "How dare you even dare to resent me?" His hand tightened on her shoulders like an iron lock, his fingers growing more rigid with each movement. She could feel her body tense, her bones literally breaking under the weight of that pressure. Her crutches weren't helping. She tried to lean on them, to reduce the pain at least a little, but every step was a mistake. The limp she'd been born with was now only becoming an additional reason for his ridicule. It was another part of her body he was using against her. She tried to move, but each time the crutches slid on the pavement, and she could feel her strength waning. "What, you can't even stand up properly?" His laughter was contemptuous. He seemed to take pleasure in her fear and physical weakness. He looked at her crutches, at her legs, at the way she struggled to move, and as if it was his victory. His every word cut her like a knife. He felt his power, his superiority. And she knew this situation wouldn't change until she gave him what he wanted, her humility. But then, at some point, when his words became unbearable, she felt something shift in her body. Not immediately, but something was shifting inside her. This constant stream of humiliation, this fear and pain, it was all building up, but now she couldn't keep quiet. She couldn't let it continue to tear at her soul, her identity, her dignity. "You have no right to talk to me like that." Her words, spoken with such fervor for the first time, pierced the silence between them. It was the first moment she felt like she wasn't losing herself completely. Though her body was still under his control, though she could not escape, her spirit, her inner fortitude began to awaken. He froze for a moment, but then his face contorted with anger again. He was angry that she hadn't submitted to him, that she hadn't let herself be broken. This was the moment when all his fury was directed at her resistance. "You still dare to give me instructions?" His voice became low, like a threat, and his hand tightened around her wrist. The pain from his grip lanced through her, but she didn't feel it so acutely now. She wasn't afraid of physical pain anymore. She was afraid of losing herself. Losing her pride. It was in that moment that she realized that the fight was no longer just for her freedom. She was fighting for her dignity. For the right not to be an object, for the right to be a human being and not just someone who could be destroyed at every turn. And that fight was more important to her than any violence. She stepped forward despite the pain. And even if she didn't manage to win today, she knew that her resilience would be stronger than all the threats he would bring to her. When the woman was beginning to feel her strength waning and every breath she took was getting heavier, when her body was ready to break under the pressure, at that moment when it seems like nothing is going to change, suddenly he appears. The sun. She sees him step off the sidewalk, but before she knows what's happening, his determined step cuts through the fog of fear enveloping her. He hadn't expected to see her in this situation. He didn't know that his mother, the one who had always been his rock, was facing the policeman who had kept her under control with such brutality. He saw her face, tired and painfully serious, but it didn't have that former calmness in it. He knew she was having a hard time, but he couldn't understand how she had to face it. His gaze immediately focused on the policeman, and something more than confusion flashed in his eyes. It was a fierce, unbearable anger. He wasn't prepared for the violence he was witnessing, but that didn't stop him. He knew he had to intervene. "Mom!" His voice cut through the silence, and even the policeman froze for a moment, turning toward him. His son stepped closer, his face tense, his eyes full of determination. He could sense that the situation had already gone too far, but to him this wasn't just an intrusion into someone else's problems, it was an intrusion into what was supposed to be his defense. He couldn't let his mother continue to suffer. "Let her go." The son's shout was harsh, filled with rage and fear. There was power in his words, but the policeman only laughed in response. He saw him as a threat, and that threat was pushing him to take the next step. "And who are you?" The policeman's gaze was icy, but the mockery in his tone made the words even more dangerous. He didn't see his son as a man. He saw him as just another unworthy, naughty person to be treated like anyone else. The son took a step forward, but the policeman clamped down on his arm, preventing him from approaching. And in that moment it became clear that this was not going to be just a verbal clash. This was a fight where the violence was not just physical, but social, racial. He could feel the weight of racism pulling him to the side, how this system was becoming more alien and sinister by the moment. This policeman was not just an individual, but part of something far more dangerous, a system that treated them as second-class human beings. "You have no right to interfere, boy." The policeman squeezed his hand even harder. His words were full of threat, but there was also a clear threat of humiliation in them. He wanted to see this young man surrender. But the son wasn't ready to back down. He jerked, trying to free himself. The situation became chaotic. The son's intervention reversed the dynamics. He was an active participant in the conflict, trying to protect his mother, but at that moment he was not only protecting her, he was fighting for his own identity, for the possibility to exist in this world as an equal. "Get out!" His son's scream was almost hysterical, his body shaking with rage, his eyes throwing lightning bolts. He felt everything in him seething. He was young, he didn't have the experience that a grown man could give him, but his heart was beating with incredible power. This was a fight where you couldn't lose. But the policeman only frowned. He squeezed his hand even tighter, and at that moment, when the tension reached its peak, he raised his free hand as if preparing to push him away. Son knew that if this moment turned violent, he wouldn't have the strength to handle it. But there was such energy in his body, such determination, that he jumped as soon as the policeman tried to push him away. At this point, everything seemed too close to disaster. But just as the tension reached its limit, something from within the son, unknown before, compelled him to act. He threw the policeman's hand away desperately, and his voice was determined, "Don't you dare touch her." However, what happened in the next few moments was more than just a personal drama. It was a clash of two worlds. And in that clash, a deeper social problem began to unfold, a problem of racism, suppression and oppression that extended not only to that moment, but to the entire society in which they lived. Let's take another short pause. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from, whether you had something similar in your life. We want to know what you think. If you like it, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. And now we continue. The son felt his blood boil with rage. He could no longer watch the policeman humiliate his mother, could no longer let him intimidate them both. His whole body clenched, and instinctively he lunged, trying to wrench her from the grip of this monster in uniform. His eyes blazed with anger, but there was something clumsy in his movements, not quite experienced. He was young, and he didn't have the coolness in his veins that this policeman seemed to have. But it was all he had: his love for his mother and his determination to fight for her. The policeman, who had not expected such a sharp and bold resistance, recoiled in surprise. He did not think that this young man, still a child in his eyes, would dare to throw himself at him. But lo and behold, as soon as his son got close enough, the policeman grabbed him by the pecs and pushed him away with incredible force. It wasn't just a pushing away, his actions were fierce, as if he were trying to break anything that might get in his way. "You don't realize who you're dealing with," the policeman shouted, his face contorted with rage. He had given in to his emotions, but that was what made him more dangerous. His hand slammed into his son's chest and he flew backward, feeling his lungs constrict and his ribcage ache from the impact. The son tried to get up, but his body wouldn't listen. In that moment, he realized that confronting this system was more than just physical, it was a confrontation with something much more powerful than just a cop on the street. It was a clash with racism, with the system of oppression that created this horror. The policeman moved toward him, preparing to strike again, but his son felt his heart pounding in his chest and his mind coming out of its confused state. He couldn't back down. He couldn't let this man continue to humiliate his mother. The thought swirled in his head: if he gave up now, if he didn't stand up and show that he was fighting, that he wouldn't just give in to the system, he would not only lose his mother, he would lose himself. He took a step forward in spite of the dizziness of the blow. He felt his fists clench and he lunged toward the policeman with incredible fury, but the policeman, seeing his movement, raised his hand, and suddenly her palm slapped his face with force. The son flew aside, feeling his body slamming to the ground. His blood dripped onto the pavement, and at that moment it seemed that all his resistance was crumbling, but even in that state, lying on the ground, he did not give up. "You think I'm afraid of you?" the cop shouted, his eyes blazing with hatred. He was ready to wipe him off the face of the earth, just as hundreds like this guy had once been wiped out. But the son wasn't ready to give in. The spark of struggle still burned in his soul, and his decision to become a part of this world, not only for his mother's sake, but for his own, grew ever firmer. "You're nothing." The policeman's voice exploded like a lightning bolt ripping through the silence. His words were filled with hatred, a racism that permeated everything around him. He was sure of his power, of this boy's helplessness. But his son rose up despite his pain and got back on his feet, ready to continue despite the fact that his body was tormented. He realized that the consequences could be dire, that this could all end in tragedy, but he couldn't afford to back down. With every movement of his son, the policeman became more and more furious. His anger and hatred no longer had any logic, it was pure destruction, an attempt to crush everything that opposed him. At that moment, the son realized that the conflict between them was more than just a struggle for physical superiority. It was a struggle for recognition, for the right to be in the world as he was. The right to exist. The battle between them continued to escalate. Every step, every movement carried not only a physical clash, but also a deep social problem. This wasn't just a clash between two people. It was a clash with a system that had always seen him as a threat. And every step he took, despite the police officer's best efforts to suppress him, was a step forward. When his son was back on his feet, despite all the pain, despite his tattered spirit, he sensed that the situation was changing. He could sense something unusual in the air, something that foretold inevitability, like an eclipse before a storm. The policeman, frozen for a moment, cast a cold, contemptuous glance at him, but something in his posture, something in his eyes suddenly changed. It was like weakness, but a weakness that carried with it a threat. "You think it's going to end like this?" His voice, filled with anger, now seemed less certain. He didn't try to hide his displeasure, but something in that policeman's look told him it wouldn't end there. The woman, watching her son, could hardly hold back her tears. She could not understand why this policeman had behaved so cruelly and aggressively towards their family, but now that the situation was reaching its climax, she felt that it might be too late to find answers. He had come down on her son not just as a criminal, but as something much deeper and layered. It was more than just violence. It was a symbol of something behind it, something elusive, yet explicit. "You don't realize who you're dealing with," the policeman finally said. His words were the same as before, but this time they sounded with an unexpected intonation. He lowered his eyes, as if deciding something for himself, and, taking a step back, added quietly, "I know who you are, and what your father was doing here in this neighborhood." The policeman's words hung in the air like a shadow. His son, who was still standing opposite him, felt his body clench. It wasn't just a remark, it was a revelation he hadn't expected. He looked at his mother, and there was horror in her eyes. The woman was struggling to understand what this confession meant. Who was her husband? The father of her son? Why had the policeman mentioned his name? "What do you mean?" Her voice was hoarse, almost helpless. The policeman did not answer at once. He stood in front of them, his eyes beginning to pierce the space, as if he himself were captivated by some invisible net. "Your husband was one of the men behind this neighborhood," he said quietly. And then her heart fluttered. The word sounded like a blow, like a revelation she had never expected to hear. "He was part of those who enforced power in this neighborhood, including through violence," the cop continued, his gaze darkening. "Your people have always been part of this world, you just didn't want to see it." He stood right in front of them, as if he knew all their weaknesses and fears. The son felt his world crumbling. He didn't know his father was part of it. This discovery shook him. He had always seen him as a hero, as someone who was out of this world, out of these street fights. But now, hearing those words, he realized that his father was part of the same machine that crushes lives, that divides people into their own and outsiders. The woman knelt down, her face pale as a sheet. She tried to collect her thoughts, but there was only one question in her mind: why? Why was her husband, the one she loved, part of a system that was destroying her people? The policeman, however, continued, feeling that he had finally achieved his goal. "You were so proud of your husband, but he was part of what you are so desperate to avoid. Whoever was here controlled the streets, he kept the system going, and you and your son are now its heirs." He said it with such a confident tone that everything around them seemed secondary. As if he were their judge and executioner. The policeman's words penetrated the soul, shattering all the illusions that the woman and her son had. Racism was not just an element of their lives, it was embedded in the structure, in the very foundation of the world in which they lived. In his eyes, they had always remained those who could be suppressed, who could be destroyed, who had no right to exist. And now, as the hidden truth was revealed to them, this system, this chain of power and violence, was on full display. The woman felt her shoulders slump. She didn't know what to do about it. She didn't know how to reconcile this with what she believed in, how she could live in a world where all her efforts, all her struggles, all her love were part of this unbearable, corrupt machine. But in that moment, despite all the pain, despite the shattering of her personal illusions, something inside her still burned. She realized that this truth, as hard as it was, had to be acknowledged. Now she not only had to protect her son, but she had to figure out what she could do with that knowledge. The world around them was beginning to crumble rapidly, like a framework that could no longer hold the destruction the system had wrought. The smell of impending violence hung in the air, like a stinking harbinger of what was inevitably to come. The son stood beside his mother, her face pale but a desperate determination burning in her eyes like a flame that could not be extinguished. She knew they stood on the brink. But what was resistance worth if the world they lived in had long since been broken? Even from the moment the policeman revealed this hidden truth, everything began to seem different. Not just street violence, not just two people fighting, but a real war in which they were mere pawns. This neighborhood, their lives, everything they were fighting for was part of a much more violent and deeper game. A system of oppression, of racism and corruption, was crushing them, and they could not escape its grip. When reinforcements arrived, the situation instantly spiraled out of control. Cars flickering in the darkness, with black windows and armed policemen, created an atmosphere of impending apocalypse. Every step the woman and her son took became more and more desperate, like a last look at a world they could not save. "You two, step aside." The voice of the policeman leading the group was loud and confident, as if everything had been decided beforehand. The woman tried to back away, her thoughts were unclear, but she knew one thing: if they surrendered, their lives would turn into another case of the system killing those who couldn't resist it. The son, standing beside him, felt his heart quicken. He no longer saw a choice. He was ready to fight, but all he was getting in return was more force against him. The cops began to surround them, blocking the exit, denying them the chance to escape. Fingers clutched guns, and menace lingered in the air. It had all become all too real. Now it wasn't just a clash with a single policeman. It was a clash with an entire system. With each step, he felt the space around him narrowing as they became trapped. He wanted to believe that there was a way out, that there was a chance, but the more people gathered around, the stronger his sense of despair became. He was just a young man who wanted to protect his mother, but in that moment he felt his struggle, his life struggle, turn into a tragedy, a moment that no one could win. "Look, kid, you don't stand a chance," came the voice of a policeman who was standing nearby. He might not have expected to encounter such resistance, but seeing his willingness to fight, he couldn't help but feel threatened. His face contorted in mockery, and despite his internal struggle, he raised his weapon. Everything happened so fast that even his mother didn't have time to react. Suddenly, in the midst of the tension, a gunshot rang out. That moment was the turning point. He wasn't the only shot that rang out in the silence. And so, in that moment when the world ceased to exist in familiar forms, when chaos tore away everything they knew about life, the sun was on the ground. It was as if time stood still, and for the woman, it was a moment when her heart snapped and her mind refused to believe what was happening. No. No. Her scream was like lightning tearing through the night. She fell to her knees beside her son, her hands reaching for him, but it was too late. His eyes no longer burned with the fire that had been in them before. He was dead. The woman stood, her hands clutching his body, unable to believe what had happened. All her life, all her efforts, their defense, their pursuit of justice had disintegrated into one tragedy that left no hope. There was a blinding light of pain and disappointment in her eyes. It wasn't just the loss of her son. It was the loss of everything she had tried to accomplish. But despite that, there was no fear on her face. The fear she might have felt before. She looked up, and there was more than bitterness in her eyes now, there was rage in them. A rage that wasn't just a reaction to a personal loss, but a response to everything she'd experienced. Fury that her son had not died in vain, that his death was a symbol of how the system ruthlessly destroyed anyone who dared to oppose it. But her son's death, his blood spilled on the pavement, was not the end. It was only the continuation of a story that continued to write its tragic chapter on the pages of this community, on the pages of their lives. It was a pain that could not be forgotten. And though this tragedy was only one of many, there was a fire burning in her eyes that now knew this struggle would not end. And it will continue even if the whole world comes crashing down on her. A few weeks had passed since the day everything changed. Her mother, still unable to fully comprehend the loss, woke up every morning and it seemed to her that the world around her had become alien. It was a burdensome reality that she could not accept. Her son, the one who had been her support and protection, was now just a memory. Her whole life, her whole struggle, for what? To see him dead on the pavement, a victim of a system she hated but could not defeat? But despite the tragedy that had befallen her, the woman felt something inside her change after all. The rage, the fear, the bitterness, it was all there, but another strength continued to burn in her chest. She knew that life could not end like this. This fight could not end on such a bitter and unfair result. Meanwhile, next door, in another neighborhood, protests are growing. People who have also lost loved ones begin to openly fight the system and those who support it. These protests become a fire that grows by the day, and soon they become a driving force that unites all those who have experienced the brutality of police oppression and racism. The woman saw it, but she couldn't just be a spectator. She had lost her son, but now she knew her place was here, among those who would not give up. One day, as the clouds thickened again over the city and the protests escalated to a fever pitch, a woman took to the streets. Her eyes were no longer filled with the same ruthless fear, but with determination. She wasn't going there to seek revenge, she was going there to change the future. To make those who continue to oppress her people realize that her son's death was not in vain. It was the spark that ignited the fire of truth. There was grief in that movement, but also strength. She was there, among those who had also lost loved ones, among those who were no longer willing to be silent. The woman didn't expect that her actions could immediately change anything in the world. But she knew that if she didn't go, if she didn't claim her right to life and dignity, everything she had endured would be forgotten. The situation in the city became increasingly tense. The police responded to the protests with violence, but every time they tried to disperse people, they stood up again. And it was a moment when a daughter, a mother, a father, a brother, each person who experienced injustice became part of something bigger. The system tried to suppress them, but its powers were not limitless. For the more they tried to douse that fire, the stronger the protest became. At the rally, as women, men, young and old stood shoulder to shoulder, a woman hastily took the microphone. There was no fear in her eyes. "My son is dead, but his death will not be in vain." Her voice sounded clear and loud, piercing everything around her. "We're all in this together. We will fight for the truth. For justice. For our children." Her words were not just a cry of despair. It was a cry of the soul, a cry that made many realize they were not alone. Everyone in this movement felt that their stories and pains were the same. And their struggles were now connected not only by personal tragedy, but also by a common desire for change. The mother knew that her son would never come back, that this loss would never be less painful, but now she had a purpose, she had a new meaning in life. She couldn't bring him back, but she could make sure that his death would not be without consequences. And even though it wouldn't be easy, even though the fight would be long and hard, she was willing to stand until the end. Her suffering became part of the collective cry of those who longed for change. And it wasn't the end. It was only the first step in a long journey towards truth. It may seem impossible now, but it is in these tragedies that true strength is born. A strength that will not stop, that will fight for the future. With that determination, the woman walked forward, realizing with each step that this was only the beginning. And even though victory would be far away, she knew that she was now a part of this fight. Because she could no longer let this world go back to what it had been. What do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your opinions are very important to us and we value each and every one of you. Please leave a comment, tell us your story, it really helps us to know that you are with us and how important each step is in the fight for justice. If you liked the story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new ones. We wish you a good day, and if you've listened to the end, write in the comments, the struggle continues. That will show you're with us all the way to the end.